Well, thank you everyone for being here, and you'll have to excuse, I think I'm not sure our name tags are in the right spot, but hopefully you'll forgive us if they're not. My name is Rana Foroohar. I'm the editor in charge of economics and business for Time magazine, and I'm really excited to be here to talk about what business can do to improve U.S. competitiveness, because I feel that has been the big question for me in my section of the magazine all year long. And I think that this issue of the bifurcation between the fortunes of companies, in particular the largest companies, and countries, is really crucial to every story that we've been covering. It's a huge part of the presidential campaign. You can see it in the ratings of everything from sovereign debt to the debt ratings of the richest companies in the world. You can see it in the fact that there's so much cash on the balance sheets of companies, and yet nations are very beleaguered. And I think that there's a real opportunity here for business to take action, and in part that's important because I think for politicians there's a risk in taking action, but for business there's a risk in inaction. So with that, I'm going to open it up. We've got about 35 minutes, so we're going to have a very lively discussion and jump right in. Feel free to question, comment, and argue. And we'll try and have a couple of questions from the audience if we have time a little bit later. So I'm going to start with the topic of education, in part because it was such a big issue in the last panel, but also because it's the bottom of this pyramid that we need to address. And I noticed in the presentation that Michael gave us earlier, it was in the lower quadrant, so something that clearly needs to be addressed, that you all feel needs to be addressed. So I'd like to ask Stan and Rashid to kind of start with a discussion of the project that you all have been collaborating on, the SixYear program in Brooklyn, and in particular, tell us what the lessons are in trying to create these liaisons between business and education, and maybe touch on some of the points of the German model that we all hear so much about. So Stan, maybe you can
Sure,
start off and
I'd be happy to start. You know, a lot of people don't realize this, but it wasn't until the end of the Second World War that high school in the United States was mandatory. Before that, it was an option, and people could leave at the end of the 8th grade, and they didn't have to go to high school, and they could find a job, and they didn't have to have any of the skills that people got in high school. And it was only the second half of the 20th century that larger and larger numbers of people got a high school education. The idea and the collaboration that IBM and the Department of Education and City University came up with is the idea of a 6-year program. Starts in the 9th grade, finishes at grade 14. Students finish with a high school diploma and an associate's degree in computer science. We work with Rashid and the people in the department and at CUNY in matching up entry-level skill requirements for jobs at IBM, and there are many for people who have an associate's degree in computer science, and fashion this partnership where we work on the curriculum together. We provide a mentor for every student in the school. We provide a mentor for Rashid, and we're very much involved as full partners in this innovative collaborative with the idea of getting kids through with an associate's degree, where there'll be 14 million jobs created over the next 10 years for people with those degrees. But let me say this, that this would be nowhere without a terrific school leader, and that's what Rashid Davis is providing.
Rashid, tell me, Stan, before we came out here, he was telling me that he wanted to work with you because you were asking the right questions. What questions did you have as you were starting this project? And tell us a little bit about what's going on the ground in Brooklyn and how this school is different from any other in the area.
So the questions really revolved around support and what type of collaborations that really were coming out and what type of best practices that we were following and what really would help the parents and students to really make this particular model different. We're fortunate to have CUNY as one of the collaborators because CUNY has been working with the city in terms of to develop schools. And particularly, we're number 13 of the early college schools that CUNY has had the opportunity to develop. And most recently, the specific college, New York City College of Technology, we are the second early college school that they've been working with. What makes us unique, really, is not only the IBM component that says workplace learning is really important. So actually looking at skills, working backwards from industry, dealing with the college, and as well as bringing in teachers into the fold and say, what are the gaps? How do we fill the gaps? How do we make sure that we could look at the idea that students, once they get into college, really don't need remediation? So how do we have those difficult conversations? How do we hire the best people who really believe that an open admissions population really have the opportunity to get the opportunities to have the middle income lifestyles that a decent career really will have the opportunity to provide?
I'm going to go back to the question of the German model, in part because I've been thinking about a lot of this myself, but it's come up in discussion in the previous panel. In Europe and in Germany in particular, we've heard a lot about how tighter relationships between business and educators have really helped the economy there and improved competitiveness. What are the lessons to be taken from the German model? What can and can't we do here? And how's that playing out in your project?
The idea of apprenticeship, the idea of internships, externships, how do we make sure, like from year one, even having every ninth grader having an industry role model, so that way in the event they don't have one at home or directly in their community, they have one now through the school that they have access to. Having a college mentor through City Tech specifically in terms of as it relates to students who are in college working to interact in STEM organizations, whether it's Women in STEM or the Black Male Initiative. So that way they are just not living within the walls of their own community, but they have access. And so the idea of access for apprenticeship, so that way specifically like the audience members here can contribute to make sure that they serve as role models to their public schools or to other organizations that are willing to make sure that there's meaningful work to students who are in high school.
And you're rolling this out now nationally, right?
Well, on Tuesday last week, Mayor Rahm Emanuel announced 5 schools in Chicago that will start next September along this model. Mayor Bloomberg announced that in his State of the City address that there would be 3 additional schools along this model in New York City. There's a lot of interest from other mayors, other businesses. There were many other businesses that stepped up to the plate in the announcement in Chicago. But to your point about the German model or a variety of Western European geographies, it's critically important that you form a much closer link between the skills that are required in business and the kinds of things that are taught in school. This doesn't change the curriculum. It makes it incredibly more challenging. As I think I was mentioning to you, we brought the president of Johns Hopkins to Rashid School and visited the math class and was blown away. And keep in mind, this isn't a school that has a special admissions criteria. As Roosevelt was talking about in her remarks earlier, this is a model that could be replicated. It's not so rich or so different that it couldn't be spread to other schools or other geographies. And that's what's important about figuring out a replication, because we've always had one great school here or there, but figuring out a more systemic change model, I think, involves thinking clearly about how do you get kids to an associate's degree level. Because if you graduate with a high school diploma, that means like $15 an hour. So you've got to get closer linkages. And what was not mentioned is that every student who completes with an associate's degree in P-Tech is first in line for jobs at IBM.
Wow, that's quite an impetus. You've met some of the students and you've talked about their blogs. Tell me, can you share some personal success stories that you've come across with these kids?
Me?
Yeah,
In terms, there 85% of the students come directly from Brooklyn, but we have 103 students, and of the 103 students, they come from 95 different middle schools. So the idea of actually trying to create a culture with students, and so you have many students who have actually just completed their robot for the first robotics competition. So we're very excited about that in the next couple of weeks. Last night, I was at the 9th grade freshman and sophomore track team championship, and we had a student who actually placed silver medal in a 300-meter competition, as he also was fortunate enough to take the English and math regents and meet CUNY's requirement in terms of that shows he's not in need of remediation. So having students who are actually coming to this particular school, showing up every day, willing to take the risk on a new school. We've been fortunate with the chancellor now looking and saying that he wants to make sure the system is a K through 14 system, using the support of CUNY to make sure that we are giving all students the opportunity to think beyond high school, because we know that the high school diploma is not enough. And we're hoping that definitely, given the opportunity and access to an open admission school, that everyone really has a possibility for the future.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to that. Bob, I want to move on to you because you're working with educators at a higher level and also with business. Tell me what's going on Roosevelt Island. We've been hearing a lot about it, obviously, in the last few months in the newspaper. What's happening and how does it contribute to the competitiveness debate?
Sure. Well, it takes a bit of lead-in, if you'll bear with me. I think that as Stan was describing, education is the cornerstone to these things, and it's education at all levels. And when we thought about this, New York City has some fantastic advantages in the sense that we have a very, very robust higher education system, highly selective, commuter and community schools all. And interestingly, New York City has about 660,000 post-secondary students. And while most people don't think of New York City as a college town, the fact is that New York City has more post-secondary students than Boston has people. Now,
Take that, Boston.
not that I'm competitive, but
Yeah, we didn't think so.
but I think but when we tried to be honest with ourselves and we surveyed some of the people that we work with in the city, that if you did a heat map of the skills that we have in terms of higher education in New York City, we're weaker relative to other places with regard to applied science and engineering. And it's just a fact. And so when you look at the economic lever that comes from places like Northern California and Cambridge and places like that, then that was a deficiency in the New York educational offering. So we basically went to work thinking about what could we do to encourage or change this idea, and we ran a process where we invited schools to apply, and we offered 3 or 4 different locations and some capital, about $100 million, for the schools that might be interested in planting a flag in New York City. And in the original process, we had about 26 schools from all over the world, and ended up with the one that we've announced so far is we've chosen Cornell and the Technion, who are forming a partnership to be on Roosevelt Island, where at the end of the mayor's term, we'll deliver them about 8 acres of clean land for them to build their campus. And so the interesting thing is the $100 million that we're providing will first of all generate jobs, which is what this is about, to build the campus, and there'll be $2 billion spent to build 2 million square feet. And then we'll actually run the campus, which is all kinds of people, and then we'll also produce jobs, and we think what the spinouts can be from this opportunity. So to make the story in a synopsis is that we believe this is a strong lever to be changing the economy, making it more innovative, and try to change this perspective. We have about a third of the engineering jobs in New York City relative to other cities our size. And so if you look forward, and the way I try to think about it, Rana, is that we have 3,000 years of an agrarian economy, 300 years of an industrial economy, and we're in the first 30 years of an information-driven economy. And if you want to get on the front foot for the information economy, then these are some of the skills we think you need.
Have you actually made any projections of how many jobs you think the complex is going to create?
Well, we've done jobs and the idea of what we think the GDP effect will be. And the returns are 100-fold in terms of the jobs to build. There'll be tens of thousands of jobs to build the facility, and these are fantastic union jobs that you'll be driving. And then you look at the number of people it'll take to run a campus of 2 million square feet. And the interesting thing is that it's not just academic types. There are all kinds of people that work on a university campus, and then, of course, trying to predict the output. And so we come out with something that will be billions of dollars of economic effect off of this investment.
Kathy, what do you think about that? Do you think that this is going to go some way towards creating a lot more sort of entrepreneurial buzz in New York and diversifying the economy?
Well, absolutely, and it's the number one concern of businesses is the engineering talent and the tech future of New York City. To remain a great world leader in the business community in the 21st century, you have to have real depth of technology talent, and that's something we've been working on for a while in the city, but that Mayor Bloomberg is obviously the right catalyst to lead that effort and to attract international interest, which is what has happened toward the end of his regime, which is great.
What have been, in your view, because I know sort of fostering this kind of small business, mid-sized business, technological growth as part of your mandate, what have been the challenges so far, would you say?
Well, New York is a place where big corporations and big firms have dominated the scene for many years, and starting back in the mid-90s, as we saw once again the city's cyclical economy dependent on Wall Street, a group of business leaders led by Henry Kravis determined that we would set up a fund that would in fact be privately capitalized that would invest not only money, but invest the talent and the relationships with the corporations, the first adopters of new technology, the Wall Street firms, would get their people engaged in building the entrepreneurial sector of our city. And our first partner in 1996 was a fund called the Flatiron Fund, which started the new media industry with Fred Wilson, who now has 200 followers on Twitter. But it began the turnaround, and Silicon Alley had its boom and its bust, but the residue of those early investments now has come back as we've seen the entrepreneurial sector grow, and no city in the world can compare with New York at this point in the digital media sector. We're trying to do the same thing, working with the city and state in the biotech area, where we've now addressed many of those problems. We've got a financial technology lab going on, which is bringing financial software companies from around the country and the world to New York to work with our major institutions. Earlier, Roosevelt was talking about linking big to small, and we think that's one of the important solutions.
Well, that's a good segue over to Vikram Pandit, linking big to small. You certainly represent big. And I know you have a lot to say about how you would like to support small, so tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think the banking impetus is on a number of different things. Small is important, but large is important too. We talked a lot about infrastructure. We talked a lot about the need for getting more competitive. I can come back to that. Here's, when we look at what we're doing, there are a couple of different areas we're involved in. We're involved with financial literacy, and it is absolutely critical to competitiveness. And so we're working with Mayor Bloomberg's Office of Small Business Services, and we set up a workshop where we have our people go in, where we have our time devoted, our funds devoted, and we set up workshops where we actually help small businesses learn about accounting, bookkeeping, how to present proposals to get funding, how you turn around and make sure you're credit worthy and all that. So there's a big effort on that part in that particular area for us, which actually has been working extremely well, and we follow through with making sure loans are available. But literacy sort of goes way beyond that. One of the things we find, it gets back to education, gets back to skill mismatch, and some of the things we talked about, is that you could use a lot more financial counselors, counseling small businesses, middle-sized businesses, things of that sort. And we've set up a scholarship program also with CUNY in their financial counseling program to make sure we can put people through there and they can come back and start working with communities to get their skills applied to help businesses. You know, it's one of the beauties of New York City is that it's really the first place for most immigrants to come in. One of the things you find when you think about that is not everything can be characterized as a small business. There are some businesses that are micro businesses that are really, really small. And when people come in, you know, they've got ideas about small businesses they want to run. And how do you finance them? How do you think about how you support them? And so we can't necessarily do that directly. We can't necessarily reach the last mile, but we work with organizations like Grameen Bank in Bronx and in Queens, or we work with Axion, we work with a lot of different organizations in New York City on microfinance projects, something we know a lot about, and make sure we impart our skills to Grameen, our skills to Axion, our funding available to them as well, and they go out and make sure that these entrepreneurs get funded as well. So there is no shortage of things a large bank can do if they think about the community in which they live as their own, and that's what we've been doing here in New York City. Just one last thing on New York City. Most of you may not know this, but this is our 200th anniversary as a bank. We started in 1812. We started in New York City. We started financing New York-Liverpool trade, and we've grown since that. And at some point, you'll talk about infrastructure, but one of the biggest things we did was finance the Panama Canal. We also, by the way, financed the transatlantic cable. I think these are all the kind of things banks do. So banks can work at the very small end. They can work at the very big end if they understand where the needs are in the communities they live in, and we've been doing that.
It's interesting, a lot of the projects you mentioned are very real economy projects, and that was obviously a huge issue in the last few years since the financial crisis. Has banking regained its moorings in the real economy, and thus is it helping competitiveness? What would you say to that?
Well, I think the reason I'm carrying this paper is because there's some data here. This is really interesting, and I think we all ought to know about. This is the data from a study that was actually commissioned by Mayor Bloomberg, the governor of Pennsylvania, Ed Rendell, and the former governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger. This is a study on infrastructure, and there's some really interesting data in here. It turns out, by the way, in 2005, the U.S. infrastructure was regarded as one of the best, if not the best in the world. And by last year, this had fallen to about 15th in the world. And here are some really interesting data points. In Chicago, which is the nation's largest rail hub, congestion is so bad it takes a freight train longer to get across from one part of town to other than to go from Los Angeles to Chicago. All right. More than 11% of our bridges are considered structurally deficient. Some of us know about Tappan Zee. And by the way, these costs are enormous enough that when you look at just the freight bottlenecks around this country, that's about a 1.6% of GDP as a cost. One of the corporations says that for every 1 mile per hour reduction in average speed of its trucks adds $2 million in its annual cost. I mean, these numbers are quite something and quite important. More importantly, though, here are some interesting numbers. The U.S. spends about 1.7% of GDP on transportation investment and maintenance. China spends 9%, Canada spends 4%. These are some really interesting numbers. I think these numbers are important because financing the real economy is not only about supporting large businesses, corporations, and for that matter, small, middle-sized businesses. It's really about supporting the kind of infrastructure needs we have. I think we've got to be realistic that at this stage, you can't turn to the government as being the only source of funding given all the other issues we have in dealing with our deficits. And we've got to set up a lot of innovative ways of getting at it. And we just did one of these in Chicago, and we talked about Mayor Rahm Emanuel, but with him, we just set up a infrastructure bank in Chicago. We, with the city of Chicago, a couple other people, this is a bank that's set up as a public-private partnership to go after this rail hub, to go after some of these infrastructure needs that they have. And if we do that correctly, it's going to be something where businesses benefit from it, and of course, the entire community will benefit from it. Those are the kind of things I think that we can do a lot more of in supporting the real economy.
Okay. Well, I'm curious, actually, Kathy, Bob, what if you had to list your top most wanted infrastructure project in New York, what would it be?
Go ahead.
Well, I talked about thinking, well, let's unpack it a little bit. I think of the 4 cornerstones to what we want to do to be an innovative economy. Number 1, quality of life. Number 2, regulation that's pro-business. Number 3, investments in infrastructure. Number 4, a longer-term strategy. Number 3 is infrastructure. And I think that these are not all within the purview of the city. But I think to just really pick up on what Vikram outlined, if you think about it, we haven't built a tunnel under the Hudson River in 100 years. We have the same capacity we had then. Number 2, our rail stations are continually crowded, and most delays in the United States in the air occur because of air traffic issues emanating from New York. So you can see that transportation is really a place that needs infrastructure. I think there's some positives. The good news is our bridges and roads that the city is responsible for are in a good state of good repair. Number 2, Mayor Bloomberg has spent a lot of money and been a big focus on the issue of clean water and how the infrastructure of the city works. And that's in a good position. So I think they're good things, but I probably would say that transportation is really one of the key issues for us. And that's not completely within our responsibility, but if I look as a citizen of the region, that would be one I would highlight.
Kathy, what would you say?
I just want to go back a minute to the competitiveness study and the survey that you all participated in to relate what we're talking about, because I think if you ask the average Occupy Wall Street demonstrator, what would a Harvard Business School panel and discussion be focusing on in terms of its community interests? We haven't heard the tax word once, I don't think. What we've heard is education, infrastructure, and concerns about the larger community and the workforce that I think are indicative of the importance of this survey, because we have in many ways, a country divided, not equally, 99% versus 1%, some would say, that's got a profoundly anti-business, anti-globalization, anti-corporate rhetoric associated with it. And I think this competitiveness survey is really an important step in changing that conversation to one that's much more constructive, less punitive, and positive going forward. So I just want to go back to that effort. I think in New York City, the business community has been engaged, particularly since 9/11 and since Mayor Bloomberg was elected. They have been engaged in a positive way of thinking and building and working with the city and state governments and with organized labor on the future of our city. I think that we have not translated that into something that Washington understands, into something that much of the rest of the country feels they're participating in. And I think this is a great starting point, and that taking this survey on the road is really important.
Well, I think you bring up a really important point, which is what's happened in New York with Occupy and what that means at a national level and indeed at an international level. You study these issues of bifurcation, and you have a focus on creating stronger economies in lower income areas. Why is that important in terms of enriching the overall economy of New York, and what should business be doing on that score to help?
Well, we recently, Bob and I both participated in a Governor's Regional Economic Development Council. We looked at the 5 boroughs of New York City. The 5 boroughs of New York City represent more than half of the state economy, its gross economic output. We also have 55% of the state's population living in poverty in the 5 boroughs. And our economic development policy, our competitiveness, has to reconcile and balance those two issues. And we as the business community have to work with government to do that. And we've found through the Regional Economic Development Council, we came out with a top priority project that Bob can talk more about, but which is interesting. Our top priority for funding and assistance to get built is the Hunts Point Food Market, which is where wholesale foods come in and which has several thousand workers, which is the most important employer in the South Bronx, the poorest county in the state. And we work together to make that a top priority, to send the signal that the business community, yes, there are things we need to do, like the Applied Sciences Engineering campus on the tech sector, but there are also things we need to do to make sure that everyone feels included in the process. And I think that's, again, the competitiveness survey really makes that point.
I think Kathy hits the nail on the head. You know, we can sit here today at Alice Tully Hall and talk about the regional issues, but let's just stop for a second. And if you're a male of color in your 20s that live in the Bronx of New York City, in that borough, then probably the unemployment rate, although it's hard to get your arms around it, is 35 to 40%. Now, let's just look at that from 2 points of view. First of all, the burden on the community to provide the social services for those people is quite high. But secondly, it's morally wrong. None of us should live in a country where that's the situation. And we should go to bed worried and upset about that and what we can do to fix it. And as Kathy said, we focus on a project in the Bronx, and the Hunts Point Market is where all of the fresh produce that goes into New York comes in, is reorganized, and goes out to all of the different grocery stores and bodegas throughout the 5 boroughs. And so because of a variety of issues, the infrastructure there is decades and decades old. A substantial amount of money needs to be invested, about $300 million, give or take, to bring all of this up to code, to make it efficient and also safe with regard to the new rules by the FDA with regard to how produce is transferred. And so thinking about this, which produces thousands of jobs in the Bronx, that this was really the focus of what we were trying to think about.
Okay. Well, we don't have a whole lot of time left, and I want to make sure that we get on to issues around supply chains, because that's so much in the conversation right now in terms of creating more robust local and regional economies. And Stan, I know IBM has done a tremendous amount of work with other companies as well. Can you sketch out the Supplier Connection network?
Yeah,
for us?
you heard earlier in the discussion, Roosevelt Cantor talked about, big companies and small companies moving together. And, obviously we want to do more in terms of jobs and job creation and U.S. competitiveness. And if you look at large companies like IBM, like Citi, like Bank of America, like Pfizer, like AT&T, they have large supply chain spending. We put together a consortia now of 14 companies that collectively have supply chain spending of over $250 billion. And we created a free site on the web through our citizenship activities where any small business can go to Supplier Connection, qualify once, you become a supplier to IBM, you're also a supplier to Citi, you're also a supplier to AMD, Office Depot, or all these other companies. And it's specifically important because small businesses, on average, that get a contract with a big company double their employee workforce within 2 years and increase their revenues by 175% only within 2 years. So if you're looking at supply chain spending of large companies and you can give small businesses an opportunity to bid on work with IBM or Citi or all the other companies that are part of this consortia, you can develop jobs, you can make the U.S. more competitive, and you can bring small companies and large companies much more closely together. And the best thing about it is it doesn't require federal legislation. It doesn't require any action on the part of government. It's something that benefits business because you want small business suppliers because of their innovation, because of their creativity, and we're going to spend this money anyway. So in the earlier panel, people talked about, well, what can business do? What business can do is to reach out to smaller business, to business associations on a community level, can work more creatively with the public sector, as in the case of fixing the idea of a 9 to 12 school into a 9 to 14 school, and to bring your energy and creativity to the table to do things that are different and new. And that's just one example, and I think it's not inconceivable that you could go from 14 companies to 140 companies and significant amounts of supply chain spending and really stimulate economic growth.
Do you have something?
The only thing I'd add to that is that what else do smaller companies need to be as part of the supply chain? When they get orders from the large companies and they want to fulfill them, they need working capital, they need money, they need loans, they need an ability to make sure that they can not only supply the products, but they can recover the money on the other side. So we've spent a lot of time not only with IBM, but looking at the entire supply chain from the large companies down to ensure we've got the products and we've got the people there to support the smaller companies who need money to fulfill these large products. Now that's especially important because the large American companies are having a great deal of success exporting. And it's something that we all really ought to be proud about. And people, right from the big ones like GE all the way to medium-sized, smaller companies, have been attracting a much larger part of the emerging consumer markets and the emerging markets, and that leads to the supply chain process. The other thing you find is there are middle-sized companies, small-sized companies now are saying, well, how can I tap that market as well offshore? And in order to do that, that takes a lot of connections, not only of the kind we just talked about, but somebody like Citi, as big as we are around the world, can bring a lot of connections to these people to say, here are some of the people offshore that could use your products, and let's see if we can work on that, and let's see if we can give you financing to export those products.
That's a great point. Stan, I want to ask you one more follow-up. The companies that have signed on to the Supplier Connections Network, do you notice any similarities, any lessons that could be taken away from the sort of companies that these are and that others could take with them?
Yeah, I think that, it's sort of when you looked at the 14 different companies, they qualified small businesses in 99% the same way. But that 1% that was different was hell on the small businesses in being able to get in the door. And it was sort of like the uniform college application. So for small businesses, they don't have a huge amount of staff. They need ease of use. They need a quick and easy way to become a certified supplier. They also need technical assistance and collaborative tools, which are easy to do technically, to be able to give them the opportunity for 4 or 5 different small businesses to get financing, collaborate together, and go after a contract with a large company. So when we talked with all of the 14 companies and their supply chain practices, it sounded formidable to bring them together, but technically when you actually got finished with it, it wasn't nearly as difficult as anybody would imagine. And now I think the 14 companies have a great story to tell to other companies. If there are others in the room representing big companies, come to the table. And the Small Business Administration, which the president has now elevated to cabinet status, is now engaging about 10,000 of the small businesses that they deal with and inviting them in on Supplier Connection. And that will grow and it will continue to develop.
Okay. Well, we have actually 3 seconds left, but I'm going to take the liberty of going a couple minutes over. And I'm going to use the rest of the time to actually share a question from one of the alums, which I think really goes to the heart of a lot of what we've been speaking about today. This is from Rogers Harper, class of 1971. I don't know if you're out there, but he asks, will solving U.S. competitiveness solve inequality in this country? What do we do about that? And even though this seems like a simple question, as we all know, it's not. Bifurcation is a huge issue even when companies are competitive. And so maybe we can all just take a couple of seconds to answer that question as it relates to what we've been talking about today. Kathy, do you want to start?
Bill Buckley wrote a book called Can We Be Equal and Excellent Too? And you can guess what his answer was. I think equality of opportunity is consistently what we have to strive for, and hopefully we get there.
Bob?
We've been watching this income disparity for close to 30 years, and it's become, the widening gap has just become something that's incredibly divisive in our country. I think most of the work shows that the best antidote to this is increasing skills and education, and unfortunately that's not a quick fix. It's things like PTech, and it's really focused on an improved public education sector that really are the answers. And I think we can have a substantially stronger situation with regard to closing that gap, but those are the right ingredients.
Okay.
Well, look, I think there's so many Americans out of work. I really think this comes down to sustainable job creation. The question is, can this approach to competitiveness create the kind of jobs we need in the country? And historically, that's been true, because back then companies were national, they were regional, they were local. You know, what was competitive for the economy turned into competitive for businesses, turned into jobs. That linkage has gotten a lot more tenuous as companies have become global. So what we've got to do is figure out how we re-hitch America, American people, back to American business. And a lot of that comes down by picking the kind of things we can do to make America competitive. Skills mismatch, infrastructure financing, making sure our cost of capital is low enough, making sure regulation is right. I believe if we do that, and if that leads to job creation, it can address the issue.
Stan, what can business do here?
I think in terms of addressing fundamental inequality, what business can do is to focus and target their attention on skills and education. I think that's the beginning and the end of the story. There are a lot of things that you can do in the short term that will make a real difference. The Supplier Connection kind of an idea, it's not a longer term fix, it's a short term fix. But if you're looking for a real way to address inequality, you've got to get more kids through with the kind of degrees that are going to get them a living wage. And let me give you an example. We did a little research at one of the community colleges in New York City, and their entry-level class, I won't name the school, but if a student entered the freshman year at a community college and were taking 2 remedial classes and one of them was math, 99% of them dropped out before the end of the first semester. And these were all kids who had a high school diploma. So if you want to get more kids through, we've got to find a way to give them the answer that kids in central Brooklyn who are going to PTech are getting, which is the education and the skills that they need to get a living wage.
Rashid, is it happening in Brooklyn?
I think that public and private partnerships are very, very important. And I think just being here, if every alum, since New York City really is the largest place for the Harvard Business School alumni, if every alumni decided to link themselves with a large public university, center, CUNY, or a public school, a public high school, it's very important for those 3 R's, rigor, roadmaps, and relationships. We know the high school diploma is not enough. And so the idea of a 9 through 14 model that says that we want New York City students to think beyond high school is very important, to have a role model who they may not have direct access to. So if the Harvard Business School and other private graduates could work with the public university system as well as the public high school system to provide those role models is hugely important, and to link their business aspects so that way the roadmaps are actually there, so that way the idea of partnerships really are not just internal in terms of going back to the private sector to say I'm going to role model someone who's in private school, but actually be a role model to a public school graduate or undergraduate student, so that way the competitiveness really can be embedded in a different sense.
Okay, great. Well, I want to end on time so we can let you all go and take action. I want to thank our panel. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm very inspired by everything you had to say. So.